Cults. A group of people with religious beliefs or practices that can be sinister or strange. Though not always controversial or deadly, their activities have led to infamous cases of sexual abuse, brutal murders, mass suicide, and terrorism. From the People's Temple and the Manson family to ISIS and the Ku Klux Klan, these groups are often credited with uncovering an ugly side of humanity. Perceived as pure evil, their leaders as psychopathic masterminds, and their members as gullible fanatics. The reality is social groups based around religion and philosophical beliefs are often misunderstood. But history has shown that what starts as innocent can easily turn sinister. There are more than 3,000 active cults in the United States. How do some of these groups become radicalized, and how do they manage to remain so active today? We wanted to find out. In the words of a cult leader, join me if you want to learn the truth.
Hello and welcome to Cults and Conspiracies, streaming live and brought to you by Hulu. I'm your host, Dash Finley, and today marks the first of our 6-part exploration into the culture and checkered past of cults. Each episode, we will be joined by real people with real stories or expertise involving cults and conspiracies. We'll hear their testimonies, raw and unfiltered, as we attempt to glean context on the process involved in joining, living in, and ultimately escaping from cults. From the downward spiral of the Manson family to the violent demise of the Branch Davidians, ruin and destruction have marked the end of many infamous cults. But today, we're hoping to explore the other side, their beginnings. How is it that seemingly normal, reasonable people find themselves recruited into these sometimes bizarre and possessive groups? Oftentimes, cults seem to appeal to people that are devastated either by the loss of a loved one or natural disaster, or by addiction and depression. However, today's guest has a uniquely different background. Laura Johnston Cole is currently an activist, Quaker, and noted public speaker, not to mention a wife and mother. But nearly 40 years ago, Laura was a prominent member of a group called the People's Temple, a religious and philosophical cult organized by a man named Jim Jones. Many of you have probably heard the phrase, drink the Kool-Aid, or have been subjected to its reference in pop culture. If you haven't, I invite you to take a look at the following clip for context. But please be warned, it's not for the faint of heart.
How very much I've loved you. How very much I've tried my best to give you the good life. There's no way to detach ourselves from what's happened today. I tell you, Christine, without me, life has no meaning. I'm the best friend you'll ever have. And once I we've been so betrayed. We have been so terribly betrayed. No, you're not going. You're not going. You're not going. It's too late. The congressman's dead. Many of our traitors are dead. They're all laying out there dead. It's not ours now. It's out of our hands. Take our life from us. We laid it down. We got tired. No more pain, I said, Al. No more pain.
Okay, Laura, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate having you on the show.
Thanks so much for bringing me in.
Can you take us back to before the People's Temple? Can you give us a perspective of what you were like in the years well before you ever got involved with Jim Jones or any of this? What was important to you? What were your values?
I was raised in Washington, D.C., in the suburbs of Washington, so I was always political. In high school, I was part of an integrated group in Rockville, Maryland, and my fellow students and I integrated a local amusement park. We were very involved in integrating our neighborhoods. We did a lot to make sure that the civil rights that we felt so strongly about were actually implemented. So from high school, even though I lived with my mother, I was very involved in politics and kind of the edge of politics, not just politicizing or not just handing out flyers, but actually standing in front of segregated places to make sure we could break down the walls that were created. The 1960s was really formative for me because it was when so many of my leaders were shot and killed. So John Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, they were all killed, executed by vigilantes. At that point, I said, I am not going to be part of a country that allows vigilantes to run the government.
What were the circumstances going from that early life and that sort of upbringing? What were the exact circumstances surrounding the very first time you ever encountered Jim Jones?
I was looking for some place where I could go, speak my mind, fight for the cause that I totally believed in. And then at the same time, I would have somebody who had a better overview who might be able to prevent some of the the falls I'd had along the way. And I thought Jim Jones was that. I mean, I felt a connection, and then to hear him talk about politics, I have been an atheist since I was in 9th grade. So I was not looking for a God or religion or church or a Bible reader. I was never looking for that. The people he was involved with were still my heroes. He was in touch with Angela Davis, Cesar Chavez, Dennis Banks, the Muslims who were, in San Francisco. Early on, we had, affiliations with the gay men in San Francisco. I mean, he was just inclusive of everybody, and not everybody had to be part of People's Temple, but we supported the underdog. We were the voice for the underdog. And so that did resound with what I wanted to be doing.
Now, if people did have beliefs that might have contradicted each other, did Jim Jones himself have a way of connecting them, or how did he speak to a variety of people from different backgrounds and with different belief systems in one unified way?
There are just probably 5 lines out of the Bible that rang true at the time, since I wasn't a Bible reader. But the part where Jesus spoke all things to all people, in a way, that's what Jim would do. Like, he would say, okay, so here's my sermon. I need to talk about religion. I need to talk about the Bible. I need to talk about, hell and brimstone. I need to talk about politics. I need to talk about socialism. Like, he had, kind of rough topics that he would talk about in every service. And so everybody heard something that they were really waiting to hear. And so I would hear him talk about politics or a call with Angela Davis or something like that, and that would kind of make my day. And it didn't really matter what else he said, because I felt that really his heart was in the politics. And I think that he did draw people in with religious backgrounds and try and convert them into being, politically active. And that's what I loved, so
Right.
I was happy.
So this period of the early 70s was a time of great tumult and violence in America, and there are a lot of charismatic and dark figures in the public consciousness, like especially Charles Manson, and the Manson family, who captured the public imagination in a way. Now, were any of these sort of past what people would brand cults today, and their deadly actions, were they at all in the back of your minds during this period? And did they, if so, were they contributing to the bad direction or the negative direction that you saw America going in?
I think that the discussion about cults happened for me after People's Temple. It never occurred to me, Jim was nothing like Charles Manson. The way I knew Jim, in the 70s, he was nothing like Charles Manson. Later, looking back, of course, there were many parallels.
Right.
But at the time, here was Jim, who was a political activist, who had a totally integrated church that people were streaming to come to. And I didn't think of it at all as a cult. I thought of it as a way, maybe a second chance for America that had been so long. I mean, that we didn't even have a Civil Rights Act or anything up until that era. I mean, I thought that Jim was going to be able to save some of the grief that was going on in the community.
Did you ever yourself personally convince anyone else or recruit anyone else to join the People's Temple?
My job when I was in People's Temple was to go to meetings and I was a greeter. One of the things we did was meet people at the front step and see if they were any kind of People's Temple material, people who were there for authentic reasons. And the other thing we would do is talk to people who were there for the first time and encourage them and tell them some of the things that went on in People's Temple other than the services. I mean, we had like free, soup kitchens, we had communal living for people who didn't have money. And so, we would talk that up, but I did not invite any of my friends and family to go. My family was distant from all that. And my sister stopped going after the first 5 or 6 times. She said Jim had too big an ego. If I had only known.
Yeah, right. So if someone were to act in a way that Jim Jones might consider disrespectful or out of line, as it were, would the punishment be simply excommunication or worse than that?
There was no excommunication. Once Jim had you, he did not want you to go. If you left, that was a whole other thing. That like people might come to your house and say, we know you've left, but we don't want you ever to go public with any of your thoughts. And they would kind of bully the person into not being noisy, not beat them up, but put that same, a threat to them. Don't talk about People's Temple, keep it to yourself. There was never any of that kind of violence when people left, which in a way lulled us into thinking, okay, so this is nonviolent. It's heavy pressure, but it's nonviolent. So, in a way, which makes the ending even that much more astounding.
You've spoken in the past that Jim Jones was perhaps in a way corrupted by some of the power that he sensed, or the sort of the leadership role that he was in kind of poisoned his mind insidiously, perhaps. But was there any one moment that you started to notice any change in his behavior, or was it just gradual?
I would say that I learned, that power corrupted him because when I looked back, I could see it. At the time, my own evolution within People's Temple was that I started out very much impressed with Jim Jones, with Jim's family, because I love his children. His sons, are still my really good friends. And so, I've loved that whole part. And then as I got more involved in the temple and I got more involved in seeing what was going on, that we were totally integrated, that we had people who were illiterate and people who were PhDs working together, treated the same, all, having the same rights within People's Temple, I was more and more, in a way, changed my allegiance from finding Jim somebody who was going to be my guiding light or protector, and I moved more into really being in love with the community. And so as I was involved, I loved the community. I loved the people in People's Temple.
So you didn't see, or you were able to see evidence of some kind of hypocrisy on his point, but it didn't bother you?
I didn't really pay attention to the hypocrisy.
His mistresses and that sort of thing. So when you saw that, it didn't really strike you?
We didn't really know that. There's no question about it that I was brainwashed. For me to ignore that or say, oh no, not me, I'm too smart for that, that's absolutely not true. What's true is that when we would have meetings, whether it was planning commission meetings or other meetings when Jim would talk about sexual partners, he would blame the mistress, or he would blame the person he had sex with. She didn't have a good self-image. She, was distraught over something or other. She wanted to leave People's Temple. She was unhappy. She, just broke up from her boyfriend. He would blame the victim. He was really full of lies to cover things, and I was really gullible, and I believed it.
Right. Now, do you think, you talk about this brainwashing type of thing, I don't want to be reductive about it, but do you think that had to do with Jim Jones's personal magnetism, or did it have more to do with you and the type of people, per se, that were attracted to the message?
I think that because I wasn't watching him carefully enough, I had turned off my critical thinking about what he was doing, what he was saying, other than the message that I wanted to hear. Like, I wanted to hear a certain message. And as long as he said that message, I kind of felt like, okay, he had proven himself, and the other stuff, I'm not going to get caught up in drama. And so, in a way, that's kind of I live my life. I'm not going to get caught up in drama, and so I just kind of wrote that off to the drama part, and I just kind of didn't allow myself to go there and worry about that part.
So there was a period where Jim Jones and the People's Temple was sort of priming people, from what I've read in these things called white nights, where they would basically be doing drills in a way for what might happen if a situation like what eventually occurred were to occur. Suicide, mass suicide, training exercises, or a practice drill, as it were. Were you aware of those activities, these white nights? Did you have to participate in them?
The only time I ever participated in anything like that was when we were in San Francisco, and we were at Ben Franklin High School at a planning commission meeting, and we were all sitting on the stage. I'm not sure if it was the stage or not, but anyway, we were sitting in San Francisco, and Jim handed out glasses to everybody, or Jim didn't hand them out, his secretaries would hand them out, and we drank them, and then Jim said that it was poison. And so different people in the audience were shills, and they kind of fell off their chair, pretended that they were dead. And so even when the event happened, to me, it didn't have the ring of really happening. It seemed like a play or drama or an act or something. It was not believable. And so I just kind of wrote it off. So much of what he did was a reaction to get people, to commit more, to do more, to get more involved. And so I just thought it was one more of his little gimmicks to get people's attention, to get us to work harder and unify.
Interesting.
Looking back, of course, it has a whole other air. There was never a time in my life that I ever expected Jim to have us take lives, to have people kill themselves.
So that was
Never.
seen as a stunt, essentially, in
Right,
your mind.
Exactly.
And it was, and you would imagine that most people in the People's Temple, other than you, probably saw it a similar way.
Right. The other part is that we were all into denial. Jim had done all these good things. We hadn't seen anybody, hurt or killed or anything. He did all these good things. How could that ever be true? We just we were in denial. We're not going to even think that could happen. So, it's really both things. It was a gimmick and stunt, and also, we gave it no credibility as anything that was going to happen.
I know you weren't present during the actual activities that led up to the mass suicide, but were you at all, had you heard any rumblings, or did you have any awareness regarding the arrival of Congressman Ryan and any of the plans that Jim Jones may have had in advance, as in terms of trying to make Jonestown look more suitable, or dress it up and make it look more accessible for Congressman Ryan? Did you know anything about that?
Well, if you take a look at Jonestown from the summer of 1978, one of the things that happened was Jim was hearing that Marshall Kilduff and people in San Francisco had an investigative journalist who was writing about People's Temple. Jim had many things that were swept under the rug. He was busted in a sting operation in Los Angeles, and so he told the members in Los Angeles that he was arrested because he had an interracial church. So we know that Jim had things to hide that he didn't want to have public. And I think that towards 1978, that's when he started hearing that people in San Francisco were really interested in what the real story was. And in San Francisco also at that time, the Concerned Relatives was a group that was beginning to get more power, saying, what are we doing? Our relatives are in Jonestown and Jim won't let them leave. We've heard that they, are, being tortured there or abused there, and our relatives can't go. So in the beginning of 78, in the summer of 78, Jim hurried to get as many people as possible out of the United States over to Guyana. And so we weren't prepared for that many people. So I'd been aware at that time, which I wasn't because, I wasn't. I would know that there's some reason that he's really pushing on the influx of bringing over people. So, and he was very much involved with the nurses because by then he was addicted to drugs. And so he was involved, several nurses took part on, became part of his staff. So in Jonestown, that was the leadership. Although Jim knew, the rest of us pretty well. So Jim was not in public very much. His secretaries and mistresses wouldn't let him out if he seemed too much into the drugs that day. They gave him uppers and downers. So really he curtailed his activities in the community and was not out walking around like he was at the beginning.
Okay, I see. But were there rumblings? So for instance, the idea that Jim Jones, who was at one time a prominent presence, was kind of fading into the background in a way because he wasn't being publicly seen due to his drug addiction. Did that prompt any rumblings among people privately that you knew who found it odd that he wasn't making appearances or that he was acting differently?
One of my friends said that she noticed that when Jim spoke on the loudspeaker, because he would speak on the loudspeaker even if he wasn't present in a meeting or something, she noticed that he was slurring his words. But my work in Jonestown a lot of times was out in the fields, and so we were outside of where we could even hear the loudspeaker. So I didn't have to, listen to that all day, and I didn't pick it up. So there were people who, were much more involved with me in the radio room and the legal staff, and Mike Prokes, different people in Jonestown who I think could see that he was disintegrating. But the general population of Jonestown did not know that. In 1972, Jim told one of his secretaries, "I keep them tired and I keep them poor, and that's why they never leave." So we were kept tired.
You were?
Physically. Right. And so I didn't pick it up as a problem. I, thought it was a challenge. I loved it. But we never had rest time to kind of review, contemplate what had happened or reflect on the day. That was not something that was ever part of our schedules.
So therefore you didn't have time also to critically and analyze some of the events happening with Jim Jones himself.
That's right.
Okay, so on the fateful day of this event, can you run through what you were doing at the time, where you were in relation to Jonestown, and what exactly went through your mind when you found out about what had happened?
When I moved to Guyana, I lived about the first year in Georgetown. Then I was banished out to Jonestown for about 8 months. So I was working in Jonestown, and I was working in the field by day and working with the kids in the evening and counseling, and then I worked in the law office. So for about 8 months, I was pretty involved in all those different things. At the end of October, Jim was talking about Ryan was coming to visit, and he asked me to go back.
Congressman Ryan.
Congressman Ryan, yeah, who's the congressman from San Mateo. And so Jim said he was going to come visit, but he asked me to go back into Georgetown. So 24 hours by boat to go back into Georgetown. The basketball team was there that had 2 of Jim's sons on it. And so we're about 50 of us lived in this house in Georgetown. So I went back in at the end of October, and then Congressman Ryan came to our house a few days before he went out to Jonestown. He climbed over the back fence and came into our house in Georgetown and shook all of our hands and said, "Hi, I'm Congressman Ryan from California. I just wanted to see how you're doing." And so, we said, "Oh, everything's just dandy. We love it. Everything's wonderful." And then Sharon Amos, who was the other person in the house, who was Jim's secretary, chased him away and said, "This is private property. You can't come into this place." So she chased him away. So a few days after that, he got out to Jonestown, and he's been on several videos that show, he told people he loved Jonestown. It was beautiful. We've done amazing work in Jonestown. And then when he stepped off the podium, people started handing him notes and handing notes to the media saying, "Jim won't let me go. I need to get out of here, and Jim won't let me leave. He's keeping me here. Don't believe him if he says he'll send us next week. He's not going to do it." And so, in a way, it gets back to your earlier question about excommunication. There was never, ever a time that Jim was going to let people leave Jonestown.
Right.
And so whether it was with Congressman Ryan or any other way, there was no way for him to release his hold on people. And so they said, "Okay, we need to leave," and Jim won't let us leave. And so Congressman Ryan said, "Okay, I'm going to call in a new airplane to pick you guys up." So they called another airplane in from Georgetown. So everything delayed things quite a lot. And finally they left Jonestown and went to the airstrip, and Jim called, sent a group of people with rifles and guns to the airstrip and with instructions to kill Congressman Ryan and kill whoever else they could, but primarily Congressman Ryan. And so they did that, and then they came back to Jonestown.
They killed Congressman Ryan.
And they killed Congressman Ryan. They killed the 3 newspaper reporters and photographers, and one former member, Patty Parks, and 4 children. So they killed them, and then they went back to Jonestown. And then they joined with the people who were in the pavilion, waiting for everything to happen. So in Georgetown, where the 50 of us lived, we didn't know any of this was going on.
Do you think, you said that Jim's sons were there in Georgetown. Do you think that was a conscious decision on some level for him to spare his sons from this horror that he might have seen coming?
You know, I think it's a total opposite. He wanted them in Jonestown, and they refused to go back.
Oh.
So he had no intention. You know, Jim would never share the limelight with anybody. He was the one, he wanted, whether it was fame or infamy, he wanted it. And so, just like he was never going to have his son take over for him, whatever he said, you know, from time to time, then it would move on. The next week it was somebody else. And then he would set them up, and then he would make sure that, you know, he would cast, you know, aspersions on their character the next week. So he would never knowingly have somebody else take his glory.
I see.
So he was not interested in anybody surviving him, particularly, you know, sons that could take some of his, you know, whether it's credit or whatever.
I see. So when you, when did you actually get back? When did you actually hear about what had taken place? Was it very soon thereafter, or was there a delay of time?
So what happened when everybody was in the pavilion, which is our main building in Jonestown, there was a message that came in to Georgetown, and Sharon Amos got it. And she sent me across town to get the basketball team, particularly Jimmy and Steven and some of the other leadership that was in the house. And so when I brought them back, she went up to the back bedroom with 4 or 5 people from the basketball team and said, Jim has sent us instruction, people in Jonestown are dying, and we need to commit revolutionary suicide. And so Stephen Jones, who was 19 at the time, said, absolutely not, we're not doing it. And she said, yeah, but Jim said we should do that. He said, we're not doing it. And so he started calling San Francisco and Redwood Valley and Los Angeles saying, if you get a call to kill yourselves, don't do anything. We're not following any instruction like that. So he kept up constant calls to the 3 houses back here to stop everything. And so they kept that conversation totally private from the rest of the 50 of us in the house.
You were not aware of it?
And none of us were aware except for that small group of like 6 or 7 people.
So basically Jim Jones's son
Yes.
saved your life.
That's right.
Essentially.
That's right. All of our lives in the house.
And do you think, had you received the order, what would have gone through your mind?
You know, I don't have any question if I had been in Jonestown.
You drank the
Yeah,
Kool-Aid,
I wouldn't. There's no way I could survive knowing that, you know, my life was destroyed there. So I don't have a question about Jonestown. In Georgetown, you know, there were some other options. You know, it kind of depended on the scenario. In Georgetown, you could walk to the end of the block and be somewhere else. You know, you could have contact with people. You could go to friends you had met along the way. So, you know, I don't know. You know, I really don't know in Georgetown. It could have gone either way, really.
So what was it, do you think, that was the deciding spark or the deciding factor that made these people take that leap?
You know, the first thing that people always overlook is that Jim Jones had proven himself to every family in Jonestown. He had saved somebody from a life in prison. He had gotten somebody off of heroin. He had given somebody, you know, a new life off of probation. He had given kids a home that was safe and away from, you know, dope fiend parents. Like every single family in Jonestown had had some family member saved or some close friend, you know, given a new life. So here you have this guy who's proven himself to every single family. So it's not like if a stranger came into a room and said, you have to do this, I don't have any problem saying, well, no, and leaving. Like, it's not like that. Jim Jones had proven himself really to each family. So he had established that he was never going to ask something of you that you couldn't do. So a big part of that was that it was Jim who was asking. The other part, though, is he said, you can never go back again. You've killed a congressman, it's been a conspiracy, we're co-conspirators, you're going to go back, you're going to be put in prison, you'll be felons because you've conspired to kill a congressman out of U.S. soil, you're going to be in trouble. You don't have a house to go to, you've given me your houses and I've sold them. You don't have any money. You abandoned your relatives, they're not going to want to have anything to do with you. They don't have money to take you on when you have no resources. You're going to be felons, your children will be taken away from you, children will be in foster care, they'll be out of your domain. And all of us from San Francisco or from California knew about foster care. So really, of all the terrors that people had, it was that their kids would end up in the foster care system. So he just said, you don't have any way to remedy it. There's no way out. There's no better way. You're not going to be able to go home and survive it all anyway. So the best thing for us to do is to do this revolutionary suicide. I remember in that period of time in the United States, Huey Newton had written a book, Revolutionary Suicide, in 1973. That was the rhetoric of the time. In the 50s, we said better dead than red. Mm-hmm. In the 60s, we talked about, becoming your own person, taking back the community. And in the 70s, Huey Newton and the Panthers talked about revolutionary suicide. If I'm going to die anyway, it ought to be when I choose to die, not when somebody else does. Mm-hmm. So what Jim was saying is all this in one, now's our chance. We're going to take that step because we have no place to go from here. And so he persuaded it, and it was Jim Jones saying it. And so people said he would never say this if there was any other choice, because people didn't know that he was, already addicted to drugs. Right. He was dying physically and mentally, falling apart. He couldn't contain it. And he had this paranoia that he had people who had left him. People had actually gotten away. Right. So, he didn't know where to come back from that anyway. So he didn't want survivors. So, all that going on at one time, people just said, he wouldn't ask us to do that if there was any other chance.
So it's kind of a perfect storm or confluence of factors.
That's
in a
right.
way, not any one thing necessarily.
That's right.
That's very interesting, and it makes more sense than
Yeah.
there were numerous things at play in the idea of an ultimatum or people feeling obligated to Mr. Jones is definitely a strong thing at play. But you personally, when you heard about what had happened and what had taken place, what was your first reaction? Was it disbelief? Or did you have any kind of greater understanding of it?
Well, what happened in the house in Georgetown was that the small group knew what was going on in Jonestown. Stephen and Jimmy wanted to go out to Jonestown and stop it. But, there was no quick way to get out there. By the time that happened, it was too late. So they couldn't go out to stop it anyway. But so they kept that information to themselves. And all of us in the house, we had our assignments for that evening. Like I had to go out to a government talent show. And so the membership or the people who lived in the house all dispersed. And when we came back, the Guyanese Defense Force was there, and they had us sit in the living room, and they brought out the body bags of Sharon Amos, who had gotten the message, and she had killed her 3 kids. So that was the first we knew of it, when they brought the body bags out. So we're sitting here not even knowing what to expect. And they brought the body bags out. So after the police talked to us and figured out who we were and what we had been doing, that we weren't there, then we kind of went to our own spaces. And I was on the typewriter. I was trying to figure out, the news said that only 300 people died. So we were trying to figure out what 300 had, stayed and who had run into the forest. We thought there was some chance that there were some people who were survivors. But there were no survivors. We kept getting the reports. First they said there were 300 people, then they said, no, there's 600 bodies. Finally they said, no, everybody is dead. And really everybody in Jonestown died. There are a group of 11 or 12 who left that morning for a picnic. There is a senior man who asked to go into the forest. He didn't want to die, and he went, and a woman slept through it. Jim sent 3 people out carrying the suitcases of money, and 2 other young men left, were able to sneak away. But other than that, really everybody else died. So 909 people died in Jonestown that day.
In the aftermath of the suicide, you returned home to America. Was that a process? How long did it take? And when you returned, did you find that there was a stigma or prejudice? Did you actually have to, what was it like coming back after all that time?
First of all, it wasn't suicide. It was murder. Because, when I first came back, I said, oh yeah, it was suicide. Like the seniors, that was murder. The children under, 17, that was murder, and everything else was suicide. It wasn't, none of it was suicide. It was all murder. Jim coerced people to kill themselves, but he murdered them. It's not, so it wasn't, suicide in any way of looking at it. They didn't have the facts. They were told certain things that were not accurate. They were held accountable for something that he did. So there's nothing about it that was suicide. It wasn't suicide, it was murder.
So you feel they were stripped of their agency?
Yeah. I mean, they were lied to at a time that they were totally vulnerable. So, and that's something that evolved. When I first came back, I thought it was possibly murder for some people. Like I said, if I had been there, if I had killed myself, that would be suicide. But, Jim didn't tell people what was going on. It was all lies. And so, that's not suicide. When you have somebody who's so absolutely, convinced that everybody should kill themselves because he had to. So that was murder. So anyway, so in Georgetown, we stayed for a while in the house in Georgetown, and then they moved us out. They had to get enough air marshals to bring to Guyana to bring us all back. At one point, they let the seniors and young children and people go back to the United States. But I had nothing to go back to. There was nothing I wanted to do. I was just barely deciding to stay alive. I didn't want to go back. I had a boyfriend who was one of the other survivors. So I said, I'll just stay. I don't want to go. So I stayed the extra week or so, and then they finally brought all of us back with air marshals, and then we went to the airport, Kennedy Airport, where we were questioned for a long time by the FBI. And so we stayed there, and then the next morning we were all handed orders to appear before the grand jury. And so we were subpoenaed to appear, and so we all came back to San Francisco. And then I moved into the temple in San Francisco because my remaining friends who hadn't gone over yet were still there. So I lived in the temple in San Francisco for 4 months. I think that 4 months was a really complicated time because I had survived, so I had all the survivor's guilt. One of the children who died in Jonestown, his mother yelled at me, "Why didn't you save my son? How is it you're saved and you didn't save my son?" And I didn't know what to answer to that. So there was a stigma around us from everybody, from the other survivors who didn't see Jim at the end. I mean, there were some survivors who hadn't seen Jim at the end, and they still had his picture up on the wall.
Well after the event.
Like after the event of Jonestown, they still thought that he was, somehow somebody else had taken over for him and made it all happen, and that he was innocent.
So were there people actually trying to continue the People's Temple?
Nobody ever wanted to continue it.
I would imagine so.
Yeah, nobody wanted to join anything or talk to anybody. Nobody trusted anybody. I mean, San Francisco tried to help the survivors by having a therapist who turned out to be a great therapist. But, we had caught Jim's paranoia bug. There was no way I was going to tell anything to anybody. And so we had to just keep it inside, and we could be with other survivors and talk about it, but we were not going to go outside the very small group.
And during this period, were you at all in contact with your family or anyone who had known you before you joined the People's Temple? Were they concerned? Did they have any feelings about this?
My family's always loved me. my mother, my father, my sister, they've always loved me. But when you go through a trauma like that, really, it seems like the only person you can talk to is somebody else who shared that experience. It was just too devastating. Like, I didn't want to explain it to anybody. I couldn't, like, sit with my sister who loves me dearly. I just couldn't go there. I couldn't explain something to somebody who wasn't part of it at the beginning. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't, like, open up that wound enough. It was enough to just kind of sit, just kind of vegetate with the other people who had survived it. But I couldn't take on trying to get somebody to understand my point of view on it. So even though they loved me and they would have done anything, I really couldn't ask them. I didn't know what I needed myself.
So how long did you feel that it took, really? I mean, of course, even today, there's obviously these things never truly go away, of course, but how long did it take you to sort of acclimate into the way where you could bring up those memories and you could discuss it?
For the first year I came back, I got a job. I went to school at night to be a computer programmer because I thought, I could be a computer programmer or a computer backup operator and I never have to face anybody. I could just face my computer screen, never have to have a conversation. I was like done with my conversations with people. So I did that for a year, but as hard as we worked, it almost became a habit to work every minute. Like, relaxing time is not something that I knew how to do. And so from the minute I got back, I didn't know what to do with free time. I mean, I'm not a mall person. I'm not a TV person. I wanted to be active, making something better for somebody. And so really, from the day one, that was always the hardest thing. What to do with free time. Okay, I have an hour, I'm not booked. What am I going to do that would help me help somebody? So I started going around to Synanon, which was a community Synanon residential drug treatment program, or the Synanon Church, depending on what name you want to put on it. But it was a community of people that was about half drug addicts who had decided to give up drugs, and the other half were people who never used drugs but who wanted to live in a community and actually wanted to have an impact on other people's lives. So I would go to work, Monday until Friday night. I'd be busy day and night, and then on the weekend I'd go over and hang out with people at Synanon. Because it was a community, like, I didn't have to explain things to them. They already lived in community. And they just took really good care of me. Like, they, recognized I was really fragile. So they took really good care of me. And, they had something called the Synanon Game, which was kind of like group therapy. And so with all that, the only people I ever talked about my experience were either fellow survivors or I would talk about it to the Synanon people who lived in community.
If Jim Jones himself was alive today and you happened to see him or you encountered him, if there was one thing that you could say to him, what would it be?
I'd probably show him an obscene gesture.
So it would be a complete and resolute anger
That's
would
right.
be the emotion.
That's right.
For all that he'd done.
For everything.
Understandable. Beyond understandable, in fact. And moving on to my final question, bringing it all around to the present day, 2017, I suppose pretty soon we'll be coming up on the 40th anniversary
That's right.
of what happened. But here we are in 2017, and America is as divided as it's ever been in many ways. You have a number of social justice causes, as there were back then, Black Lives Matter movement, historic Women's March movement, etc. And then on the other side, you have the rise of the alt-right and certain hate groups and extreme polarization in American society. Do you see any parallels to the social climate that brought about the People's Temple and the rise of Jim Jones? And do you think something like the People's Temple could take root today?
One of the ways that Jim Jones was able to do what he did is that there was nothing in our recent history that was anything like Jonestown. So back then, there was nothing somebody could say, like, don't forget Jonestown, don't forget Jonestown. So nobody could warn me that what I was seeing was part of the deception. And now we do have a point of reference. And so I think that that's saved a lot of people. I think, and I think that's why the conversation is so important. Jonestown had many lessons for all of us. You know, nobody has it. You can never be so happy that you stop looking around you to see what's really going on. You can't take, you know, people can say anything they want. Don't listen to what people say. What are they doing? Are they doing something that helps the cause of justice, or are they impeding justice? Are they abusing people close to them, or are they actually nurturing people close to them? I think that Jonestown and learning about Jim Jones has taught us that you can never take anything at face value. It's what people do. What are they doing? I don't think Jonestown could happen again unless we stop talking about the lessons of Jonestown. We can't stop.
And you're making sure that that doesn't happen then?
Well, and I'm trying to. I'm trying to make sure that we don't forget it. There are many lessons, you know, for me personally, for just my family, for, you know, San Franciscans, for Californians, for the United States. There are world issues that we can learn more about if we study Jonestown. How did, you know, a friend of mine, UC Kiwana, wrote this wonderful book about Guyana, and he took it even further steps, saying, you know, we have a group of mostly white, which wasn't necessarily true, but at least mostly North Americans who have money coming into third world countries, and they think they can manipulate the government and do what they want. That's what Jim Jones did. And it's not just Guyana, you know, it's happened in Haiti, it's happened, I mean, we could list, there's a huge list of countries that are co-opted by people with riches from other countries who take over the government and the management and the care of the people. So, I mean, there are issues from the tiniest issue on a personal level to world issues that we have to not just succumb to that kind of oppression. Not let people who are mentally ill or rich and wanting more, not letting them take over countries.
Well, Laura, thank you so much for sharing your time and your experiences with us. It's meant so much to me and everyone watching. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And I do love questions. People send me questions, and I put it on my website because I think that, you know, I'm a teacher. I've been a teacher for 20 years, and I like to follow the curiosity. So if people have questions that weren't answered, I really do address everybody's question if you contact me. Because I think if you're interested enough to ask, then I want to be able to give you the answer.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank our wonderful guest, Laura Johnston Cole, for her time and her incredible story. We've all learned a great deal from her. Next week, we will be joined by another great guest as we take our next step down this winding path towards understanding cults and conspiracies. I'd also like to say, if you enjoyed our program, the subject matter and reality, I urge you to check out Hulu's The Path, which revolves around these very same topics. Now, I've been Dash Finley, your host, and until next week, thank you for watching.